Hi everybody, I'm John Donvan, and thank you for watching Up for Debate. So here's how this show works. Experts from around the world weigh in on a proposed resolution. That is a strong statement about an issue or an idea that impacts all of us. It could be anything from the death penalty to international relations to the spread of smart technology. And then as two teams argue for and against what that statement says, I help to moderate a tough but fair and smart debate between the two sides and let you draw your own conclusions. In today's Up for Debate, Newsy and Intelligence Squared US consider the impact of humanitarian interventions in global crises. I'm talking about those situations where war and political upheaval put the lives and safety of whole populations at risk of atrocities and even genocide. Present-day examples would be places like Myanmar, Syria, or Yemen. Proponents of intervention say the world's most powerful militaries have a responsibility to protect innocent civilians. Opponents say that intervention is often ineffective and can actually worsen a conflict. This debate was presented in partnership with the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum. We had 4 experts go 2-on-2 to debate the following resolution: humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. Arguing for the motion are Frank Ledwidge and Rajan Menon. Ledwidge is a senior fellow at the Royal Air Force College and a former military intelligence officer. Menon is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Students. He's also authored several books. Arguing against the motion, Bernard Kouchner and Cory Shockey. Kouchner is a medical doctor by training and co-founder and former president of Doctors Without Borders. Shockey is the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Let's get this debate started.
It has gone down in history as a case of moral failure on a massive scale. The genocide nearly a quarter century ago in the African state of Rwanda, where up to 1 million people were slaughtered while the outside world watched what was going on and did almost nothing to stop it. And yet, out of that catastrophe came new impetus for a concept called humanitarian intervention. The idea, the principle that when a state is unable or failing to protect its own people from genocide and crimes against humanity, then other states have a moral responsibility to go in, to protect the vulnerable, and to use military force if necessary. And a quarter century on, how has that principle worked out in practice? In places where it's been tried, say Kosovo or Libya, does the record show that on balance such interventions are successful? Or on balance, do unintended consequences take over and undermine the goal? And right now, with what's going on in Syria, what's unfolding there, does the past argue for humanitarian intervention there or the opposite? Well, we think this has the makings of a debate, so let's have it. Yes or no to this statement: humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. And you can at this point tell us what you believe about this resolution. If you agree with it, vote yes. And if you disagree, vote that you are against. Sorry, it's for, against, and undecided. Vote for. You're for the motion, for the resolution. You're against the resolution, or you're undecided, which is a perfectly reasonable starting position to hold.
Before you get boisterous, because John told you to be, I should tell you that Frank and I will sound a little bit like Grinch at a Christmas dinner. And the reason for that is, who wants to hear, after all, that humanitarian war does more harm than good? This is a project that saves lives, that ends atrocities, and invokes universal human rights. It is an idea that should unify the world. Alas, it has divided it, and divided it deeply on fundamental issues. Who has the right to intervene? Under what circumstances? With what objective? To stop atrocities and end there? Or to then overthrow the regime, as happened in Libya? Or to stop atrocities and midwife the birth of a new state, as happened in Kosovo? These issues have not been resolved. Now, critics of humanitarian intervention worry about something else, and that is, will this ostensibly universal principle be applied universally in practice, or bent and twisted by the powerful and applied selectively?
Humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. Not at all. You were talking, and this is a big mistake, about military intervention, not humanitarian. It doesn't mean anything, humanitarian intervention. Let me give you some examples. The first one, yes, sir, you were talking about Rwanda. April '94. Sorry to say I was there during all the genocide with my people, doctors and medical staff. And we did a lot. Compared to the genocide, compared to, let's say, 8,100 of dead people massacre, it was nothing. But believe me, humanitarian intervention is not a problem of numbers of dead or victims. If you can save one, and if it is your daughter or your sister or your father, this is a very important one. Humanitarian means human being. Human being, you have to count one after one. So it's not a question of military intervention. You were right in some of your examples. But we were before, and in Kosovo, we were before the humanitarian people, working with the people, not with the government. There was no government, it was the Serbian government. So this is easy to counterattack all your examples. Afghanistan, but we were since 20 years working with the people. And there is still an hospital in Kabul, bombed every day, with explosion every day in Kabul. But the French hospital is still working, without the government's help at all.
What I would like to hear from our opponents tonight is where we are going to get 60,000 troops to secure even a relatively small country, not so far away, let alone one of the invadables that Rajan was talking about, which are likely to be much further away. And the kind of war we're involved in, let's be brutally frank about that. Non-international armed conflicts, internal strife, call it what you will, they're civil wars. And they are the most brutal, complex, and difficult operations that can be conceived. You were involved, when you were in operations such as that, in a three-dimensional chess match, in the dark, against multiple adversaries, who tomorrow may be your allies, others, your allies today, may be your adversaries or your enemies tomorrow. Against a background where if you are not absolutely certain of where your objectives lie, ladies and gentlemen, you have no business being in such an environment unless you're absolutely sure that you can secure yourselves and the people you are there to protect.
Humanitarian interventions are not always conducted by the military, although very often they need a military component in order to make them successful. And the reason that is because humanitarian crises aren't natural disasters. They're not earthquakes, they're not acts of God, they're acts of political malevolence. That's why violence is used for political purpose. That's what causes humanitarian crises. It's not a famine. It's an act of political violence by a government or another political actor. When that happens, that means a society is broken in some important way. So I think we ought not to set the standard that humanitarian interventions very often fail to solve the underlying political problems, that they very often have unintended consequences, that they very often are complicated and get bogged down and you lose your focus. The undertaking is intrinsically extraordinarily difficult. It's a society in transition where violence is being used for political purposes in order to gain political outcomes. But that doesn't mean they never work. So even if you don't buy Bernard's impassioned appeal that even one life deserves defending, there are practical, hard-edged policy reasons to engage in humanitarian interventions.
So, should Western nations intervene militarily in global humanitarian crises? After this break, Newsy and Intelligence Squared US will go deeper into that question. You are watching Up for Debate. Welcome back to Up for Debate. I'm John Donvan. We are hearing a fascinating debate on whether Western nations should intervene in humanitarian crises around the world. Let's get right back to it.
And now we move on to round two, and round two is where the debaters take questions from me and from you, our live audience here in Brussels. They can also put questions to and interrupt one another, and I will be interrupting to move things along. In round two, we're going to explore what we just heard in the opening round. We heard from the team arguing for the motion, Frank Ledwidge and Rajan Menon. We heard an argument that against humanitarian intervention on the grounds that they have been divisive, that they are applied selectively around the world, that they have uncontrollable consequences, and that the price to do it right is actually too high. And they say that this has been demonstrated again and again. The team arguing against the motion, Kori Schake and Bernard Kouchner, they make the point that the right metric for humanitarian intervention is one life at a time. There is, however, a strategic component, that there are strategic reasons for participating in humanitarian intervention, and that there are consequences for inaction as well. So that sort of lays out where we are, but I want to jump a little bit to the news of the moment and the week that we're in. We're debating this in a week, and in fact on a day when, Bernard, your organization, Doctors Without Borders, has put out a report that in the last 2 weeks alone in Syria, 1,000 people have been killed. There are 4,800 wounded, according to Doctors Without Borders, which we consider a credible source. Now, your opponents have told us that to intervene in Syria now or even 8 years ago would have been a fool's errand. You touched on this briefly in your opening, Kori. Would it have made a difference 8 years ago? And would it be worth going in even now into Syria with the kind of intervention that you're talking about and supporting?
Yes and yes. It would have made a difference then, because it would have helped adjudicate the divisive, difficult political debate internal to Syria. It would have restrained the ability of the Syrian government to use brutality as a weapon of political control. The fact that we have done it poorly in some instances doesn't mean we haven't also done it well. Sierra Leone is a great example where the British government engineered an intervention.
But let me stop you there, because I would like to get you to those examples from the past. I just want to stay on the Syria question for a moment and take it to your opponent, Rajan Menon. The same question, in response to Kori Schake having just actually made a very powerful statement that drew applause, that it would have been, Syria was a case then and now for humanitarian intervention.
Well, I sense headwinds from the audience, but I think it would have been complete madness to intervene in Syria. I hold no brief for the blood-drenched Assad regime, but here's what happened. A peaceful demonstration was set upon by a savage government. Very quickly, the opposition was radicalized, and within a matter of months, the groups with protests on the ground were either Islamists or people who wanted to create a Salafi state in Syria. Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, if you send weapons into a society where alliances are shifting, borders are shifting, corruption is existing, do you have any guarantee that the weapons are going to go to the good guys? And who were the good guys as time rolled along? Look, let's not have a competition for compassion and tragedy here. That's not what this is about. Whether Frank and I care about dying people, of course we do. The question is, how do you make a very difficult decision that balances ethics and strategy?
Let's let Bernard Kouchner respond to that.
Yes, another time we're talking about military intervention. You are right. The first scene of massacres was...
You should be on this side.
No, on the contrary. You should be thinking about what I'm going to say.
Oh, I am.
This is, my dear, not a humanitarian intervention. We were in Syria. My people, the Médecins Sans Frontières and Médecins du Monde, they were already there. And we took care of the wounded people, because you are starting the story with the massacre of the army, Bashar al-Assad army, fighting on the crowd. But formally we were there. And we are still there, but this is so difficult and risky. Don't ask the humanitarian people to be heroes and to want to sacrifice their life. Sometimes they are talking about their family, thinking about their family. But we were there. Don't mix another time.
Well, let me step in, Bernard. Let me step in, because you asked me to listen to what you said, and I did. And I think you're a little off point for the thing that's at stake here, which is the question of putting military force into the game in order to carry.
Don't believe that humanity, sir, please. We are not responsible of the direction of the army. We are not responsible of the selling arms.
I have to step in. I don't want you to pivot away from what we're debating here. What we're debating here is whether it's justified for a nation to put military force, blood, and
toil. But I'm not a nation. We are humanitarian people. We are not a nation.
But we're asking what nation should be doing. That's the question.
But this is not absolutely not the problem.
Okay, I don't want to be debating with you about what the debate is about.
Involvement.
May I take a swing at this?
Yes,
please go.
Me too. Me too. We are talking about humanitarian...
No, it's her turn.
No, sir.
Corey,
please. We are talking about humanitarian involvement. She's talking also about humanitarian.
Corey, take it.
Not about the nation and the army.
Okay. So it seems to me that you are suggesting that any use of military force has to be an enormous use of military force, or that anything else would have failed. Windows of opportunity open and close with time.
Good question.
And if, for example, in the specific case of Syria, if, for example, we had taken away the government's ability to use air power, that would have leveled the playing field.
Humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. What do you think of that? Up for debate. We'll be right back. We're back with Up for Debate. Back to the idea that humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. Here again, our debaters.
I'm very keen to get stuck in here because I can't let this pass. First of all, when you just take out a nation's air power, you don't do that. You make war on the state, and the Syrian air defense system is probably the strongest outside the Western world other than Russia. That would have been an extremely difficult undertaking, an act of war. And you might agree with me when if I were to say that perhaps Russia might have had something to say about that, given that they essentially run Syria's air defense system and much of its defenses. And also Iran, who have, both of whose nations, whether we like it or not, have serious interests in the region. No, the woulda, coulda, shoulda argument doesn't work, because what, in my view, would have happened is we wouldn't have had green, white, and red flags in Damascus. We'd have had black flags in Damascus had we intervened with the 82nd Airborne Brigade.
But you're both talking about unknown outcomes. I mean, you're talking about what would have happened.
Exactly.
But you're doing the reverse. You're doing the reverse as well.
I don't believe in woulda, coulda, shoulda.
So
okay, Bernard, why don't you come back into
Yes, please. But who is able to give the clearance to the humanitarian involvement? To whom do we have to address our question? Are we supposed to follow a government? We are not following a government. We are just answering to the victims' call. So when the victims are in Syria, we tried, and sometimes we succeeded, in sending, let's say, this is, of course, this is surgery for them, because unfortunately it was not something else. So when is the starvation or the welcome of the refugees? Also, the humanitarian involvement is necessary, and we don't have to to call for a permission. So there is a sort of vocation, one by one, without any governmental decision.
But you talked in your opening, Bernard, about sometimes some operations need military protection. That's what we're talking about.
No, of course, yes.
So in those situations, what your opponents are saying is, actually, that's never going to be a good thing. That's never going to work, and that's what's at stake here.
John, we're not saying it's never going to work.
Okay,
we're saying it, generally speaking, it does more harm than good.
Fair enough,
That's
because you also said the reverse. You said sometimes it doesn't work, but generally speaking, it does.
Of course,
so
yes.
on whole.
John, may I?
Yes. Razvan.
Look, I have great admiration for Mr. Kushner. He is a towering figure on the world stage and a true humanitarian.
Absolutely.
But let me ask you this, and this does not apply to, this is not, there's a but coming, but not yet, yeah? But let me ask you this. If there's so much compassion in the West for suffering people, Why haven't we done something that's much easier than taking out the Syrian air defense system or sending arms into Syria? Why is the World Food Program and the UNHCR going around with a begging bowl because rich countries have not provided what they promised?
But go there.
Kushner. Now, one other thing.
Go there.
One other thing. I had a very clever debating teacher. She was brilliant. And she told me, if you can't win the argument, reframe the debate. Mr. Kushner is talking about aid, relief, mediation, and all this. No one disagrees with that. It's the sharp end of the stick that has made this debate so controversial. Why? Because we've seen it used, and often with cataclysmic consequences. And on the point that Iraq was not a humanitarian intervention, when they didn't find WMD, what did some of the humanitarian interventionists, not Mr. Kushner, Tony Blair and others say? Well, we got rid of the dictator. You got rid of the dictator and turned the Middle East upside down. That's what you did.
No, but
All right.
I'm sorry.
Bernard, finish your point. I want to move on to something else, but go ahead.
This is a big misunderstanding. A big misunderstanding.
Please enlighten me.
You are not talking about humanitarian intervention. You are talking about military and sometimes with humanitarian, sometimes without. This is not. This is your problem, but this is not the problem of the people defending and offering to suffering to heal the victims. So
John,
this is not the same thing.
So we're finding an interesting distinction that there are military interventions with a humanitarian component and that there are humanitarian interventions with a military component. And I think that's a little bit where the dividing line is. But I want to move to another topic that your opponents brought up again. I'll bring this to you, Corey. They talked about having public support at home. So you're an American citizen. You know the political situation there. There's a president who's arguing for an America First policy. There are national priorities like, say, the opioid crisis or education or even paying for infrastructure. Today, as your opponents say, how could a president who wants to persuade the American people to be behind a humanitarian intervention using military force in somebody else's country, using their treasure and their blood?
So my favorite reflection on the war weariness of the American public actually comes from the satirical newspaper, The Onion, which argues that the nation's college professors are weary of the burden they're carrying of our wars, right? Because the nation's college professors aren't carrying the burdens of our wars. And in fact, the American public hasn't objected to this president of the United States with his America First doctrine from increasing troops fighting in Afghanistan, from increasing troops fighting in Iraq, from increasing troops fighting in Syria, from increasing troops fighting in the Sahel. Those are not all humanitarian interventions, but if the American public were so weary of the burden of war, the president would be paying some political price for that. And in fact, what you see is the reverse, right? Your average American gets drawn out into the world by the expressions of our values.
Let's take that point to your opponents. Frank first.
Whether President Trump never sends another soldier abroad, the United States are in hock for $5.6 trillion for what's gone on over the last 16 years. That's the cost, never mind the 6,000 dead soldiers, 60,000 injured soldiers, and all the other political costs. You're in hock for that already. And I would suggest to you that there's very little appetite for another dollar being spent on that kind of intervention.
I'll let Rajan go, and then you can have...
Ladies and gentlemen, when all else fails, attack professors. if only we had the influence that Corey thinks we have. Look, I'm not talking about university professors. Who cares about them? I'm one. I'm negligible. I spend a fair amount of time with military people. You know how I started doing it? I worked for 2 years on the New York City suicide hotline and talked to our troops who come back. All we do is tie yellow ribbons around trees and wave the flags. They come back maimed with PTSD, and I have talked to them exactly about this. So please don't tell me that I'm sitting in an ivory tower. I have friends who have served there. And I can tell you, when you leave this echo chamber called Washington, D.C., and go to Missouri or Oregon or Texas, there's no stomach for this. And ladies and gentlemen, don't take my word for it. Pew has done very good polling on this. When you tell people that the cost rises in blood and treasure, support falls off. Look it up.
I want to go to some questions from the audience now. The way this will work, I'm going to be given a microphone and I will come and hold it for you so that I can take it back when I need to. And I just have a couple of rules on this. I want to ask you, do not debate with the debaters. Get them to debate with each other. So actually ask a question. Please make it terse. I don't mind if you state a short premise, but really ask a question, and you'll know it's a question if whatever you say naturally comes a question mark coming at the end of it. That means that it would work. But I'd like to come right here, actually. And if you could stand up, and we'd like you to tell us who you are for the people who will be listening. And welcome to Intelligence Squared and German Marshall Fund debate. I'm going to hold it. I'm going to hold it.
Hi, Dania Khatib. I think I'm the only one from Syria. I'm half Syrian and I'm half Lebanese. And I totally agree with Corey. And I've worked very closely with refugees. And for the two gentlemen who advocate that not to interference, what do you suggest how to end this? Let Assad kill another million, 500,000, and to now half of this population is refugee, till all the population is refugee. And I'll tell you something from working very closely with refugees. The reason we have ISIS is because the America didn't intervene. When Hezbollah and the Shia militias and the Assad, they went and raped 11 years old and they destroy mosque and put the banner of Ya Hussein. This was
okay, I'm gonna step in to actually take your comment to the point of what we're debating, and what I want to do with your question, if you're fine with that, is take it to the ISIS question, unintended consequences. They're saying she was saying the unintended consequences go in the other direction, that ISIS is there because Syria fell apart, because there was not earlier intervention.
ISIS is there because the Iraqi government, which was at the time pretty much extra-legal, supported and sustained Shia militias who were murdering Sunnis at much the same rate that ISIS murdered Shias. And I don't think there's too much controversy about that. And that's an offshoot of the Iraq War. And by the way, I myself used to see the conditions in which we kept some of those prisoners down in Qasr prison camp. That's the source of ISIS. It has nothing to do with whether or not we did or did not intervene back in 2013.
Okay. Let's let Kori Schake, would you like to respond as well? You don't have to, but I want to give the crack at it.
It certainly is true that the decisions that the United States and other intervening powers in Iraq made, both the decision to invade Iraq and then the decision to leave Iraq in 2011, facilitated the rise of ISIS. There's no question about that. But it's also a lesson about what solves these problems, right? Because if you think about the Iraq case, when the United States and other countries cared about good governance, helped establish an environment where Iraqis felt secure, they were beginning to make brave political choices. In the parliamentary elections in 2010, for example, all the major slates were cross-sectarian. So you can see how this works when it works, but you can also see how it fails.
This is
too little local knowledge, with too much hubris, with too little commitment, with too little caring about solving the underlying political problems is how these fail.
I have another question. I'll hold it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I got it.
Yeah.
My name is Natalia Kalyada. I'm coming from Belarus and dealing with Perfuminat. The question is, last week I met with Sean Westmoreland. He is former US Air Force veteran and pilot of drones. And he truly believed in humanitarian intervention. But it's appeared that, according to the report by his bosses, that he killed 200 plus enemies. And then UN reported to him that he killed 359 civilians. So his belief in humanitarian intervention disappeared. How would you comment? Is it worse to have those civilians deaths that are much higher than military enemies?
Okay, so again, I'll boil that down to good example of unintended consequences. What does evidence like that do to your side?
I'm not in charge of the drone system. I'm sorry. And
but what about,
okay, if you ask us if we are the humanitarian people, let's say, roughly, in favor of peace, yes, we are. And we proved it.
That wasn't what the question was, though. But that wasn't the question. The question was...
No, but the question was the murder by drones. attack.
Is it worth 300 people killed versus 200 lives?
I'm in charge sometimes because they call us.
Okay, so let me take it to Corey then, because
no,
it's
but sorry, you cannot change my mind.
I'm not trying to change your mind at all.
It's not a humanitarian question.
I'm trying to stay on the point of the military action.
You are misunderstanding.
So I think that's a terrible and a tragic example of where things can go wrong. But the fact that things can go wrong and bad things happen doesn't mean they always happen. It doesn't mean good things aren't also. It seems to me that humanitarian intervention is necessary. That's not an argument for doing it badly. It's an argument to improve your knowledge, especially your local knowledge, to prevent mistakes like that from tarnishing the good that needs to be done.
Rosanne, do you have more to add to? I mean, that question was sort of a big softball for your side, so if you can really add to it, otherwise I'd like to go to some questions.
I just want to speak to you for a second. You've spoken with great eloquence and compassion, and I respect your knowledge. You've identified the problem, but you haven't elucidated the solutions. Now, on the business of people are learning, making proper choices, democracy, corruption, we have heard this for 15 years. There are serious problems in my country with infrastructure, poverty, income inequality. The out-year cost of these two campaigns, that are unwinnable, by the way, is $5 trillion, all right? And we want to have more of this? It's not feasible. There are many problems in the world that admit no solution. There are many more problems, ladies and gentlemen, that admit of no American solution. It is a tragic world. Nobody wants people to die here. That's not what we're arguing. It is what is feasible given the constraints.
Stay with us. We'll have more debate right after this break. We're discussing the pros and cons of humanitarian intervention. Here again, our debaters.
Quick question for both sides. For Frank and Rajan, what do you make of the relatively successful 2014 humanitarian intervention to protect the Yazidis in Syria? You didn't mention this instance, but it was a relatively limited instance of the use of force that saved about 50,000 people. Do you consider that to be a mistake? The primary thrust of humanitarian intervention is that to the extent that you could do something good, as Corey pointed out, with limited resources, you should do it. And for your side to win, you would have to argue that that intervention, which didn't have any sort of secondary or tertiary consequences, was actually a mistake. And for Corey, if I may.
No, just one question. Okay. Thanks, but it's a great question. More evidence from the other side. Frank,
I'd like to develop.
You guys are really doing the full Bill Clinton here with the walking around thing. Okay, it's your choice.
Yeah, I'd like to address that directly. It's not our case that military humanitarian intervention is always going to cause more harm than good. It can cause good if it's well planned, limited in duration, and strategic in nature. And the Yazidis is one example. However, I'd also point out to you that 4 million Iraqi Christians, are now outside their own country. They were not protected, and very many other minorities within that country. So this was a very narrow, very limited intervention, and as a result, successful. The same applies too, to some degree, by the way, as you said earlier, Corey, to the Sierra Leone intervention in '99. Extremely limited, extremely to the point, and very, very short.
But I hear Corey and Bernard arguing that if it meets the conditions you just set, then their side wins.
No, well,
Corey, you are basically saying that, right? So I'm wondering,
and Corey can name one intervention in the last 20 years, which was, by the way, an off-the-books action by a British general that was not authorised by his government, a rather brave action by General Richards. That's the only example you can point to. Plus the aid drop, because that's what it was. There was very little military involvement other than that to the Yazidis a couple of years ago.
So that's it. I think the intervention in East Timor, led by Australia,
yes, and in Kosovo,
counts as success. I think Kosovo counts as success. I think the 1991 protection of what we now come to think about as the Kurdish territories of northern Iraq, which was not a narrow or limited intervention, was an enormous success.
Another question here?
Do you think we should review the tools, UN and Bretton Woods agreements?
And I want to add to that question, would a review of the tool, is there a way, I think this gentleman is basically saying, is there a way to improve the processes to turn the tide against the situation in which you're arguing? In other words, is there something to be learned from the past to apply to the future, a set of guidelines to do this right that would, 30 years from now change your mind about how things went?
Well, we might consider some political solutions, as you suggested. I was talking to a NATO official a couple of months ago concerning Syria, and I asked whether or not we might consider, and this isn't political, it's more financial, why instead of sending our troops, American troops, British troops, European troops to somewhere like Syria, we might consider, I don't know, targeting some oligarchs in London, making sure that they have, for example, immigration problems. And this senior NATO official said, yeah, you know what? I put that to my chiefs, and it was rejected. This is not the kind of solution that was felt to be appropriate. Instead, we devolve immediately to military solutions.
Bernard.
I already told you that we are mixing up everything, but I want to answer about migrants.
Is there a question?
They are dying in the Mediterranean Sea by thousands. 2 French boats or 3 French boats are in charge of rescuing them themselves. We didn't ask the government. One is Médecins Sans Frontières, the other is Médecins du Monde. This is a humanitarian intervention and not a military intervention. And we have a lot like that. Starvation, disease, Ebola. Who is at the first rank to intervene? Humanitarian people. Do you want to suppress that or not? This is not always a question of war and peace. This is a question of human being and answering to suffering. That's all.
Rajan.
If this were a debate about mediation, providing relief to refugees, and so on, there would be no debate. Frank and I agree with this. What has made the project of humanitarian intervention controversial is the military dimension. Now, I take fully, now hang on, I take fully Mr. Kushner's point that there are other forms of it, but we are talking about the most pernicious forms. Now, can I quickly respond to a point that Corey made? I'll be very fast, very fast. East Timor and Kosovo. Here's the thing. The intervention in East Timor was possible because the TNI, the Indonesian military, agreed to stand down and not resist. Had they not, it would not have happened. In Kosovo, NATO pilots were restricted to flying no lower than 20,000 feet, even though the Serbs scaled up the killing. This goes to my point that the capacity to really suffer and die on behalf of these missions, ladies and gentlemen, is limited. That is a political question, not just a military question.
Is your mind being changed on this one? We'll be right back. And now our experts present their closing statements on this resolution.
Leading off with his closing statement, Rajan Menon. He is professor at the City College of New York and senior research scholar at Columbia University.
2 minutes, right, John?
2 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you were to visit my study at home, you would see bookshelves groaning with books on humanitarian intervention. And I want to tell you a personal story. I started out on this side of the debate, partly from reading about the incredible work that people like Mr. Kushner do. I had enormous sympathy for the intervention in Bosnia. I do not want people to die. That's not what this is about. It was a long and difficult and painful road to me, for me to come to where I am coming. We have to, in this tragic world, read Max Weber or Thucydides, filter moral issues through difficult circumstances. We may have people who are being put under enormous distress and would like to do something. But a president has to, or a prime minister, this goes to you, ma'am, has to put an enormous amount of attention on the political realities and the military risk. You've been in a very energetic crowd, and I sense where the momentum of the crowd is. But please don't misunderstand us. We don't take any joy in arguing the position. It is not the idea that humanitarian intervention is always bad, as witnessed the gentleman's question on the Yazidis. I think that was a good move. I supported it. The proposition is not whether it is always bad. That's not what we're arguing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Razan. Again, the resolution, humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. And here to make his closing statement against the motion, Bernard Kouchner, co-founder of Doctors Without Borders and former French foreign minister.
Let me say that your sentence is not good. You have to write humanitarian bar and military intervention does more harm than good. It will be better, and it will be more close to, let's say, the question you're asking. This is not humanitarian intervention, but humanitarian and military or under military umbrella. It will be better, because you were never talking about humanitarians, that is to say volunteers, not guided by government, people close to the others. Second, of course, you quoted some of the point where it was necessary to intervene, but it was impossible to intervene everywhere, because a state and an army, especially an American army, or the British army or the French army are not bad. But humanitarian people are completely a little group, few people, under their own decision, under their own charter. This is not because we were asking, as I told you, the approval or the clearance from any government. So do you want to suppress that? Certainly not.
Thank you, Bernard Kouchner. Once again, the resolution, humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. And here to make his closing statement, Frank Ledwidge, Senior Fellow at the Royal Air Force College and former military officer.
Ladies and gentlemen, in such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. Now, Clausewitz, the famous Prussian general and theorist, said that just under 200 years ago, and it holds as much today, holds as much water today as it did then. The disasters and catastrophes, the wreckage of which we're dealing with now, over the last 15 years, should give anyone pause before any kind of military intervention is considered. But there are times, aren't there? And it's not our case on this side of the House that humanitarian intervention can never work, only that, generally speaking, it does more harm than good. And one major example of that was revealed by Bernard himself in his last but one speech, and that's Libya. And Bernard doesn't need reminding, and nor do you, as to why it is that all those thousands of refugees and migrants are dying in the Mediterranean. That's because of the appalling mess we made of Libya. I include myself in that. There are times, ladies and gentlemen, when we're tempted to do great and good things. Let me give you an analogy. We can see on the top of a mountain that there are people in desperate need of help. We know we should do something. We know something must be done. But we also know that if we go on that mountain to rescue them, we don't have the kit, we don't have the oxygen, we don't have the resources to help them. We should do something, but we can't. Ladies and gentlemen, I was in Beirut a couple of years ago, and I met a young lady very similar to the young Syrian woman who spoke before. And I was there rather pompously to find out what Britain could do to ameliorate the situation there. I'll never forget her response when she found out that I'd already been involved in several of these failed interventions. She said, "Haven't you done enough?" Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Support the motion.
Thank you, Frank Ledwidge. And our final speaker in closing rounds, Kori Schake. She is Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, making her closing statement against the motion. Kori Schake.
So our opponents in this discussion are big-hearted and well-meaning and made a lot of good points. Humanitarian interventions do often fail. Too often governments engage in the desire to do something without thinking their way through what ought to be done, how to limit it in a way consistent with their limited interests in a particular problem, or with the limited opportunities that a particular problem offers us. But to suggest that humanitarian intervention does more harm than good overlooks the numerous cases where it has done more good than harm. The Yazidi example, intervention in the Balkans, both in Bosnia and in Kosovo, interventions in East Timor, Sierra Leone, the French intervention now in Mali is definitely doing more good than harm. These sometimes have a military component. They very often need a military component to freeze the situation in place because these crises are the result of political choices by political actors. And you're exactly right. Doing it well requires knowing a lot, coming in with a sense of humility and not trying to overwhelm local actors, but to set them up for success. And I still think the best commentary on this ever was from Edmund Burke, who said, "The use of force alone is but temporary. It may subdue for a moment, but it does not remove the necessity of subduing again. And a society, a country, is never to be governed that must perpetually be conquered." In order to do humanitarian intervention well, you have to solve the underlying political problem. You have to create the basis for a different kind of sustained political agreement going forward.
Thank you, Kori Schake. And that concludes our closing statement. And now it's time for you to tell us which side you feel has argued the best. We want to ask you again to go to the app and go to the section on interactivity and look for the vote. And once again, you'll be given the option to vote on exactly the same resolution. Humanitarian intervention does more harm than good. You have the choice of for, against, or undecided. And I'll repeat, we'll have the results in about 2.5, 3 minutes, so you'll know who's our winner. But I'll repeat, we give victory to the team whose numbers have changed the most in percentage points from the first vote to the second vote. In the first vote on the resolution, humanitarian intervention does more harm than good, before the debate and polling you here in Brussels, 30% of you agreed with this motion, 51% were against the motion, and 19% were undecided. In the second vote, the team arguing for the motion, their first vote was 30%, their second vote was 34%. They gained 4 percentage points. That is the number to beat. The team against the motion, they went from 51%, their second vote was 59%. They pulled up 8 percentage points. That means the team arguing against the motion, humanitarian intervention does more harm than good, is declared our winner. Congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US and the German Marshall Fund. We'll see you next time.
Of course, it is human to want to do something as we watch crises unfold, and even to consider using force to stop those things from happening. But as we have heard, it is complicated. The moral and the pragmatic sometimes get into conflict with each other and become not easy to sort out. That's why this topic is, in fact, up for debate. We'll have a group of new debaters picking up a new topic, same time, same place, next week. Thanks for watching Up for Debate.